Well, happy feast to you all. Nice to see you here this afternoon. Beautiful, beautiful spring day. I'd like you to turn to John chapter 18 for my message this afternoon. Here we have in John chapter 18 one of the most noted conversations in Scripture, and we see it taking place between Jesus and Pilate. And it's narrated to us in John chapter 18. Now at this time, many of the religious leaders were trying to expedite the process and were trying with their many machinations to create the scenario where Jesus would immediately be pronounced guilty so that they would get on with the execution. This is what they wanted to do, kill Jesus. But the Passover was approaching, and they could not pollute themselves by going into the wrong places or to be touched with the wrong objects. And so they came to the home of this Gentile Pilate, and they really couldn't enter in. So to keep themselves ceremonially clean, they kept themselves on the outside, and Pilate invited Jesus in and asked him a few questions. And this is the conversation and how it went when Jesus and Pilate interacted. John chapter 18 and verse 33. Then Pilate entered into the praetorium again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "Do you say this thing of yourself, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight, so that I might not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." And Pilate then said to him, "So you are a king then?" And Jesus answered, "Well, you say that I'm a king, and to this end I was born, and for this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is on the side of truth hears my voice." This is one of the most, this is one of those hinge verses in the New Testament right here. And what's intriguing about this poignant reply from Jesus to this various questions of Pilate is that Pilate possibly raises one of the most important questions ever raised by a human being, but he never pauses for the answer. In verse 38, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And with that, after he said this, he went out. What is truth? And he turned and walked away. Now, I think this could be applied as a metaphor for what's happening in this world today we see around us. In particular here, though, I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus brought up the idea of truth at this particular time of year. Of course, truth is relevant at any time of the year, but it seemed more especially relevant at this time of the year during the Days of Unleavened Bread and the Passover. So let me set the context by taking you back for a moment when ancient Israel was held captive in Egypt. So for over 200 years, while Israel was in Egypt, they imbibed on the Egyptian culture. They took it in. The truths that were brought down to Egypt by Jacob and his sons were, I guess, cast aside because of the culture that they lived in and becoming slaves of the culture. And as time progressed, Israel began to be squeezed into the mold of the Egyptian culture. And even though they were slaves, they saw idols all around them. They saw the rituals, they saw the ceremonies, the pagan festivals, and it created an imprint on their mind of what worship should look like. How it was like, how it should be accomplished, how to behave in it. And truth had been subverted. It had been buried, it had been covered up. And the further the children of Israel moved away from God in their sojourn, the further they moved away from truth. So much so that by the end of the sojourn, the children of Israel didn't even know when the Sabbath day was. And it had to be revealed to them again by this miraculous food called manna. They had lost the understanding of the commandments, and God had to thunder them out again from the holy mountain. They had taken up the festivals of the pagans, and instead, God had to show them the holy days once again and reveal them to them one by one, beginning with the Passover while they were in Egypt. So imagine, if you will, actually think about this. When you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes, let me take that back. Let me go back for a second. Have you ever gotten up in the middle of the night, right, to go to the bathroom or do something? Maybe you forgot something, turned something off, and you wake up and you're like, I can't quite see very well, and you have to stand there for just a minute to sort of let the light kind of hit your rods and your cones a little bit, right? So you can see just a little bit better so you can move about. So you're sort of groping in the dark. I know getting up to go to the bathroom sometimes at night, I'm like, where's the wall? Where's the door? Because I don't want to hit my head into the doorway. And I'm kind of, guiding my way over there. And by the time I go back to bed, I can see, somewhat well. That's kind of the way I think the children of Israel were in Egypt, spiritually. The light was turned off. They didn't see things very well. And they became accustomed to the darkness around them, and they adapted their way of life to that spiritual darkness. And as a result, they veered off course. They didn't exactly know what the path looked like. And God saw at a specified time in their sojourn to bring them the light of truth back to them. And He turned the light switch on. And as He turned the light switch on, He began to lead them back to Himself. They could see the path now. Consider this for a moment. Ancient Israel had to have a recognition of the truth bringer and the word of truth in order to take action to place the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. In fact, Moses, remember, when he came to God at the burning bush, he said, what am I supposed to tell them when I come to you? Who is this God? And He said, tell them I am that I am. Somehow they knew if He said this to them, they would know this is their God. He was revealing them to Himself back to them again. Oh, this is going to sort of maybe wake them up a little bit. So when they placed this blood of the lamb on the doorposts, there was some sort of a faith to do this. And in doing so, the firstborn, because of this, were spared. And then they had to respond. They had to do something. When they were called to gather to Ramses to leave Egypt, they had to gather things together and go there. And then they acted, right, by leaving Egyptian soil when they left Ramses. And those were steps they had to follow through on their journey from darkness to light, from falsehood to truth. And they began to course correct from the course they had veered off from so many years ago. Now, for us today, we're required to live in a world each and every day that is filled with falsehood, that's filled with lies. And really, it's not hard to get accustomed to the ways that the world does things and to become leavened by the attitudes around us, or as Paul puts, to be conformed to it. I'm going to give you, I think, a perfect example of this. When I went to college, and one of the questions they wanted base knowledge of the freshmen when they entered college. And so they would ask us, write down the 10 Commandments in order. This is sort of a test. Write down the holy days in order. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of people that couldn't get the holy days in order, right? They couldn't even get them in order. So if you ask them to name the world's religious holidays, do you think they could name those? Do you think anybody forgot Easter and Christmas and all those and when they were? No, it's because they were saturated. We are saturated in the culture. So frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if you asked a lot of teens when Christmas was, when Easter was in the church, and when were these things held, and they would know. But when it comes to the holy days, I have to think about that for a little bit to know when they were, maybe to name them in order. This is very common. We live in this culture and we've become accustomed to it and conformed to it. G.K. Chesterton said, "The danger of disbelieving in God is not that a man ends up believing in nothing. Alas," he says, "it is much worse. The danger of disbelieving in God is that a man ends up believing in anything." That's the danger. And brethren, the closer we get to God, the more we understand what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is evil. And the days of unleavened bread are a time of leaving sinful Egypt. It is a time of course correction. Exodus chapter 13 and verse 8 says this, "You shall tell your son in that day," what day? This day, saying, "This is done." What is done? Verse 7, "the eating of unleavened bread, because of that which the Lord has done unto me when I came forth out of Egypt." When who came out of Egypt? When I came out of Egypt. Every one of you, all of us have come out of Egypt. God makes it very personal to you and to me. Not when Israel came out of Egypt, but when you came out of Egypt. And just as the children of Israel left Egypt, we too have to march through the wilderness, and we have to leave the comforts of spiritual Egypt behind. But in order for that to happen, we have to recognize the truth bringer, just as they did, and the word of truth, just as they did. We need to recognize those things. But inherent within the recognition, brethren, is knowledge and discernment of good and evil. We have to know what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's evil. And it's through this recognition of truth that we are able and willing to act as the children of Israel did in order to move from a sinful condition. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer of Germany, while trying to pick up the broken pieces of his country after World War II, stood outside. Actually, I think he stood in his office looking out the window and looking at the destruction that lay before him. He'd invited a famous evangelical preacher over there at the time during after World War II. And I think it was something like this. Konrad Adenauer turned to this man and he said, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ? And the man said, of course, we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He said, well, good, because outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, this is what Konrad Adenauer said, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I see no other hope for mankind. That was pretty astute, I think, for this chancellor to say something of that nature. Brethren, the hope of mankind was resurrected during these days of unleavened bread. And it is the event that the early apostles talked about. How could it not be? Christ was risen. He was truth incarnate, and now He's truth resurrected to correct our course, to bring us to a correct course from darkness to light, to enable us to leave our own Egypt. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 for our last scripture here. Paul is going to give a course correction of these days, and it ties in so well to what Christ was talking about with Pilate. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, "Purge out therefore the old leaven." In other words, he says, get rid of that which infects you, that which is keeping you off course, that which pulls you off course, that you may be a new lump as you are unleavened. So this is beginning a fresh dough, not a piece of the old dough that's leavened, right, that's infected. It's the fresh dough. And the leaven spreads, we know, and it starts anew with a piece of old lump. And we're still leavened if we use the old lump. But we have to start with a new lump. Throw out the old lump, start with a new lump that's unleavened. And it says in verse 8, it goes on to say in verse 7, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Verse 8, therefore let us keep the feast. What feast? The Feast of Unleavened Bread. Not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and what? Truth. The unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul is talking about a course correction. So when Jesus says, everyone on the side of truth listens to me, he was making a most meaningful statement with the Passover and the days of unleavened bread approaching. Pilate asked the question, what is truth? And he turned and walked away. Yet God's true people have to respond to the question because we recognize that the death of Christ realigns us with God and truth. And just like Cleopas and his companion on that road to Emmaus, they had the opportunity to walk with the resurrected Christ. Well, we walk with Him today as He lives in us. And so He's helping us and leading us out of the wilderness and correcting us with the truth of righteousness. So, brethren, it is with Him we walk through these days, even as Israel did with the pillar and cloud of the pillar of fire and the cloud, right? Those, we walk with Him, and it's with the resurrected Christ that we walk through these days, guiding us with truth that lights and corrects our path.